Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy for part 2 of our series on Reconstruction, where today we will look at the rise of the KKK, the 15th Amendment, whether Reconstruction was a success or a failure, and much more. Last time we noted how there was 2 periods of Reconstruction, presidential and congressional, and we left off in congressional. We saw how the South had passed the Black Codes, which limited the rights of the freed slaves, and how Congress fought back with the passage of the 14th Amendment, providing citizenship and equal protection for the freed slaves and all Americans. We looked at how the South had been divided into military zones run by Union generals and federal troops, and how congressional Republicans came 1 vote short of impeaching President Johnson. And today we will see how Reconstruction left many issues unsettled and the future of African Americans in doubt. And just a reminder, teachers hit this PowerPoint with a wide variety of materials that are available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Just click the link in the notes below this video or search for Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy. In 1868, the Republicans chose the popular Union Civil War general and hero Ulysses S. Grant to be their candidate. Grant dominated the Electoral College, but the close popular vote demonstrated the fragile balance of the Republicans' power. Votes by African Americans helped secure the victory for Ulysses S. Grant. In 1870, the 15th Amendment, guaranteeing, quote, universal male suffrage, was passed, establishing that the right to vote could not be denied based on, quote, race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This would provide a split with women's groups who had been strong supporters of abolitionism. Unfortunately, though, women would have to wait another 50 years to vote. However, with African American men's guarantee of political participation, black men were voted into elected office. Close to 2,000 African American men held some form of elected or appointed offices during Reconstruction. Governor Pinckney Pinchback was the first African American to hold that position, and Hiram Revels became the first black elected to the U.S. Senate, where he was joined by 6 African American members of the House of Representatives in the 41st and 42nd Congresses. However, Southern whites still maintained control over much of the political power in those states. While most white Southerners were Democrats, there were Southern Republicans who were given the derogatory nickname of Scalawags, as they were seen as betraying their fellow white Southerners. The Scalawags were joined by Northerners who moved south and were given the nickname Carpetbaggers, in reference to the cheap suitcases that they were portrayed to have used. Both groups were criticized throughout the South for trying to get rich off of political patronage, even though many carpetbaggers had come down there to help. Republican-controlled Southern state legislatures passed measures to build public schools, rebuild roads and railways, and other public works such as hospitals and prisons. With these works, however, came higher taxes and corruption, and would eventually help lead to their opposition. Of course, it wasn't just the South that was experiencing corruption. General Grant's term in office was filled with corruption scandals, and in both the North and the South, these often revolved around the construction of railroads. With the passage of what are often referred to as the Reconstruction or Civil War amendments, the federal government had exercised far-reaching powers over states' rights. However, resentful Southerners were determined to undermine these new protections. Violence and intimidation towards blacks was widespread throughout Reconstruction. In 1866, 41 African Americans and 3 white radical Republicans who had gathered for a constitutional convention were killed in a riot in New Orleans. The creation of the Ku Klux Klan, an underground group, terrorized the freed slaves throughout the South. Lynchings, beatings, and murders were used to intimidate blacks from exercising political rights. In 1871, Congress passed the Force Acts and the KKK Acts to dismantle the group, and were semi-successful for the time being. However, that didn't stop the violence. In 1873, in what is known as the Colfax Massacre, 150 blacks were killed by Southern Democrats in Louisiana. And violence like this took place throughout the South. It wasn't just violence, though. White Southerners also turned to the political arena to regain control, led by politicians known as Redeemers, who thrived on the growing resentment of federal intrusion. At the same time, many in the North had tired of Reconstruction and began to turn their interest elsewhere. Racism did not just exist in the South, and it seemed to be on the rise in the North. In 1873, an economic depression gripped the United States and spread to Europe. Known as the Panic of 1873, Republicans and Northerners became more concerned about their own economic interests than those of the former slaves. While Congress did pass the Civil Rights Act of 1875, promising equal access to public accommodations such as transportation and the right to serve on juries, it was rarely enforced and eventually overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. By the time of the presidential election of 1876, with splits in the Republican Party and Democrats making gains, many considered the time ripe for the end of Reconstruction. The election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden was incredibly close. Tilden had won the popular vote, but the electoral votes of 3 southern states were disputed. A federal commission was created to put together a highly controversial backroom agreement known as the Compromise of 1877. The compromise gave Hayes and the Republican Party the victory in exchange for the removal of federal troops from the South, in essence, ending Reconstruction and turning over the fate of African Americans to Southern Democrats. This proved highly problematic for African Americans as the Jim Crow era, which we will look at later this year, began, and it saw practices such as poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses remove blacks from the political process, denying them the right to vote. This relegated African Americans to poverty and powerlessness, both economically and socially. In 1896, in a U.S. Supreme Court known as Plessy v. Ferguson, the court ruled that separate but equal facilities were constitutional, in effect legalizing segregation throughout the South. While the South had temporarily succeeded in neutralizing the 14th and 15th Amendments, they would be the foundation for the Civil Rights era of the 1950s and 60s. And the 14th Amendment's equal protection under the law clause would eventually bring down legal segregation, starting with the 1954 case of Brown versus the Board of Education. Historians and the public continue to debate the legacy of the Reconstruction era. For many years, historians portrayed the process as governmental overreach by a vindictive North. The racism that existed in the South and the North for decades, and to a certain extent to this day, painted the freed slaves as being unfit to participate, both politically and economically. In the Civil Rights era of the 1960s, revisionist historians viewed Reconstruction as flawed but well-intentioned, and it provided important social changes, such as public education. Some today even argue that the former slaves made incredible progress during this era. Overall, though, most modern-day historians view Reconstruction as a failure, exemplified by the Jim Crow era. Reconstruction, however, has to be looked at in the much larger context of an incredibly complex and developing time in U.S. history, in which many Americans were not looking southward but westward, and one that ultimately politicians focused more on the new economic realities of a rapidly industrializing nation than the plight of the former slaves, which is where we will pick up next time. But before we do, let's review. What Union general did the Republicans elect president in 1868? Ulysses S. Grant. Which amendment gave African American men the right to vote? The 15th. What high political offices were African Americans elected to? Well, one was elected governor, one to the U.S. Senate, and several were elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. What was the derogatory name given to Southern Republicans? They were called Scalawags. What was the name given to Northerners who moved to the South during Reconstruction? Carpetbaggers. Public works like railroads led to this in both the North and South. corruption, and high taxes. What is the name of the terrorist group that used violence to suppress black political participation? The Ku Klux Klan, or KKK. This economic depression made Northerners rethink their interests towards the freed slaves. The Panic of 1873. What was the name of the deal which gave the White House to the Republicans in the election of 1876 known as the Compromise of 1877? What did the Republicans and Rutherford B. Hayes promise to do in exchange for the compromise? Well, they promised to end Reconstruction and to remove federal troops from the South. What is the era following Reconstruction in the South known as? The Jim Crow era. What tactics were used during the Jim Crow era to exclude blacks from the political process? Well, there was a lot, but among them were poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and outright intimidation and violence. And that's it. I want to thank you guys for watching. Be sure to subscribe because up next we're going to look at the Gilded Age. And just a reminder, teachers, that this PowerPoint with worksheets, quizzes, guided notes for flipped classrooms, Kahoots, lesson plans, and additional activities are available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Just click the link in the notes below this video or search for Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy at Teachers Pay Teachers. Again, guys, thanks for watching.